The Roman army is remembered today as one of the most disciplined, effective, and awe-inspiring military forces in human history. We picture endless ranks of legionaries in gleaming armor, their red standards rising above the battlefield as they march in unison, an unstoppable tide of steel and order. Roman propaganda, carved in triumphal arches, painted on frescoes, and sung in the rhetoric of poets, wanted us to remember precisely that. Rome as bringer of civilization, order, and law. But behind the polished facade of discipline and glory lay a darker reality, one that rarely makes its way into the marble reliefs and victory inscriptions. For the soldiers who conquered vast territories, crushed rival civilizations, and expanded Rome's dominion from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, war was not just about honor or service to the Senate and people of Rome. It was also about entitlement, spoils, plunder, and the unspoken license to commit acts so cruel, so degrading, that they were seldom recorded in the annals of official history. The Roman war machine was not a purely professional body, driven only by strategy and discipline. It was also a social organism, made up of men far from home, hardened by years of violence, and given a kind of moral immunity by the empire they served. Roman commanders, from generals like Julius Caesar to emperors like Augustus, promised their soldiers rewards for loyalty. Sometimes these rewards were in the form of land, sometimes gold, and often, too often, in the form of human lives. The victims of Roman conquest, particularly women and children, became not only the spoils of war, but instruments of humiliation, trophies that testified to Rome's dominance. To understand the Roman army in its full dimension, we must strip away the layers of marble propaganda and look at the lived experience of those conquered. It is a story of triumph, yes, but also of unspeakable atrocities. Consider the way Rome itself justified war. The Senate would often declare that campaigns were defensive, that they were forced upon Rome by treacherous barbarians or by rulers who refused to respect treaties. This legal ritual, the facial rite, allowed Rome to claim moral high ground. Yet in practice, once a city was captured, the laws of war, the ius belli, granted Roman soldiers wide latitude. Anything taken in conquest became legitimate plunder. Men might be executed or sold into slavery. Women were almost always enslaved, their bodies commodified alongside livestock, gold, and grain. It was not seen as a crime, it was seen as the natural order of things. Roman victory meant Roman possession of land, wealth, and people. The poets of Rome, often writing with the patronage of generals and emperors, sometimes let slip glimpses of this darker reality. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, spoke of the mythical rape of the Sabine women, a story that was not just myth but a foundational justification for Rome as conquest mentality. Horace, praising Augustus, described conquered women paraded through triumphs, their eyes cast down in shame. These were not warnings, they were celebrations of Roman dominance, and behind the triumphal processions that dazzled the people of Rome lay countless acts of individual suffering in conquered provinces, carried out by soldiers whose victories gave them absolute power over the defeated. The brutality of conquest was not incidental, it was systemic. In Gaul, Caesar boasted of enslaving hundreds of thousands after his campaigns, a number that included entire communities of women and children. His Commentari de Bello Gallico framed these actions as necessary for security, yet modern historians recognize them as calculated acts of terror, designed to break the spirit of resistance. In Judea, after the revolt of 70 CE, tens of thousands of captives were sold, paraded through Rome as symbols of defeat. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, wrote of women dragged into captivity, subjected to humiliation, and dispersed into slavery across the empire. Within the camps of the Roman army, the suffering did not end once the battles were over. Female captives were dragged along as camp followers, forced into labor, or subjected to the whims of the soldiers who now owned them as property. Ancient sources rarely describe this directly, preferring to cloak such realities in silence, but the very absence of detail in Roman accounts speaks volumes. To the Roman elite, such acts were unremarkable, too routine to be worth recording. Only when abuses became political weapons, accusations hurled at generals or emperors, do we catch hints of the cruelty that festered beneath the surface of Rome's disciplined legions. What makes the Roman atrocities so chilling is not just the scale of suffering, but the way they were normalized. To Roman eyes, there was no contradiction between marching under the standard of the eagle, swearing oaths to Jupiter, and treating human beings as disposable spoils. To be Roman was to be civilized. To be conquered was to be less than human. This worldview provided the moral armor that allowed legionaries to commit acts which, by modern standards, would be considered war crimes. In fact, the very structure of the Roman triumph, a celebration of conquest that marched chained captives through the streets of the capital, was itself an act of humiliation, one that made the suffering of the defeated into public spectacle. And yet, while Roman sources are often silent or celebratory, archaeology tells a different story. In Britain, mass graves suggest entire communities slaughtered. In Gaul, coins and inscriptions bear witness to the sudden erasure of towns whose populations vanished. In the eastern provinces, records of slave sales spike after Roman campaigns, evidence of how quickly the defeated were commodified. Behind every triumphal arch lies a trail of human misery. Behind every marble statue of a general lies the silenced voices of those conquered, enslaved, and abused. This is the paradox of Rome. It gave the world law, roads, architecture, and literature. But its army, the very instrument that made such achievements possible, also spread terror, suffering, and degradation across continents. To understand Rome in its fullness, we must look not only at the shining legacy it left behind, but at the dark shadow it cast, a shadow borne most heavily by the most vulnerable. And so, as we begin to explore the atrocities committed by the Roman army, we must set aside the romantic image of legionaries marching under the midday sun, shields gleaming, banners flying. We must instead look into the smoke of burning cities, the chains of enslaved captives, and the whispered cries of those who were never meant to be remembered. The story of Rome is not just one of glory, it is also one of brutality. And the unspeakable acts carried out by its armies remind us that the price of empire was often paid in human suffering. Rome's armies did not simply march to war as hired professionals, they embodied a culture of conquest that shaped the very identity of the empire. To be Roman was to dominate. To serve in the legions was to enact that domination in its rawest, most brutal form. The discipline for which the Roman military is so often praised was not separate from cruelty, it was intertwined with it. The soldier's oath, the sacramentum, bound each legionary not only to obedience but to the idea that Rome's victories justified any action. And in this framework, atrocities were not aberrations. They were the logical extension of Rome's ideology of superiority. The Roman soldier was taught from his earliest days in the camp that victory entitled him to spoils. When a city was taken, the practice of sack, the looting and exploitation of conquered populations, was not just tolerated, it was expected. Commanders allowed it as a reward, a way to maintain morale after grueling campaigns. Ancient military manuals, such as Vegetius de Re Militari, emphasize strict order and training. But even these texts concede that soldiers needed incentives. Gold, land, and human captives were among those incentives. The rape of conquered women was rarely mentioned outright in surviving sources, yet it hovered in the background as a silent, sanctioned reality. It was part of what it meant to win. This sense of entitlement grew from Rome's concept of the spoils of war, spolia, which extended beyond weapons or wealth. The human body itself could be plundered. In triumphal processions, generals displayed not only stolen treasures, but also captive women and children, paraded in chains before the cheering crowds of Rome. These human trophies were meant to remind citizens of their empire's might. For the captives themselves, it was humiliation on a public stage, and for the soldiers who had seized them, it reinforced the idea that Rome's enemies were not people of equal worth, but objects to be used, discarded, or consumed in the name of empire. This mentality was sharpened by the structure of the Roman army itself. Soldiers lived for years on campaign, isolated from their homes and immersed in environments where violence was routine. The very rhythm of legionary life, marching, drilling, constructing camps and engaging in constant skirmishes, nurtured a hardened psychology. Mercy was weakness. Restraint was cowardice. To show leniency to the defeated was not a virtue, but a betrayal of Roman supremacy. And so the line between battle and atrocity blurred. Soldiers accustomed to slaughter on the battlefield easily transferred that brutality to the treatment of captives once the fighting was done. The culture of domination was also enforced from the top down. Roman generals wielded imperium, absolute authority over life and death during campaigns. They decided the fate of entire populations. Cities that resisted Rome were often subjected to collective punishment. After the fall of Carthage in 146 BCE, its inhabitants were slaughtered or enslaved en masse. Polybius, a Greek historian who witnessed Rome's rise, recorded these events with a mix of awe and horror. The destruction was systematic, not spontaneous. It was Rome's way of sending a message. Resistance would be crushed so thoroughly that no one else would dare defy the legions. And within that crushing force, women and children bore the heaviest burden, reduced to spoils whose fates were left to the soldiers' discretion. What made Rome unique was the way it cloaked this brutality in legality. The ius belli ac pacis, the law of war and peace, gave formal justification for conquest. If a city refused Rome's demands, anything that followed was considered lawful. In this sense, atrocities were never crimes in the Roman world. They were rights exercised by victors. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest statesmen, spoke often of justice and virtue, yet even he acknowledged that the laws of war granted conquerors total power over the conquered. The contradiction between lofty ideals and brutal practice lay at the heart of Rome's empire. We can see this contradiction vividly in the figure of Julius Caesar. In his commentaries, Caesar portrayed himself as a rational commander, waging defensive wars against barbarian aggression. Yet his accounts also boast of the annihilation of entire Gallic tribes, the enslavement of hundreds of thousands, and the distribution of captives to his soldiers. To Caesar, these acts were not atrocities but demonstrations of Roman efficiency. To the Gallic survivors, they were catastrophes that destroyed communities and left generations in chains. The Roman army's culture of domination, sanctioned from the highest levels, made such horrors inevitable. Inside the camps, this culture shaped everyday interactions. Captured women, absorbed into the legions as slaves or camp followers, occupied the lowest rung of an already brutal hierarchy. They were expected to cook, clean, and perform hard labor, often under constant threat of violence. Some were used as symbols of status by officers, others were treated as common property by rank-and-file soldiers. To the legionary, these captives were reminders of Rome's victory, living proof of his superiority. To the women themselves, life in the camp was a cycle of fear and degradation. Yet what is perhaps most chilling is the silence of Rome's own chroniclers. Tacitus, Livy, Suetonius all describe Rome's wars in detail, but they rarely dwell on the suffering of the conquered. Their silence was not ignorance, it was indifference. Roman historians were writing for Roman audiences who saw nothing unusual in the army's treatment of captives. To them, such acts were not worth recording unless they served a political purpose. A general might be criticized for excessive cruelty if it reflected poorly on Rome, but the underlying system of domination went unquestioned. This silence is itself a form of testimony, revealing how deeply ingrained atrocity was in the functioning of the Roman army. The normalization of violence against the vulnerable had lasting effects on Roman society. Enslaved women taken from conquered territories filled the households of Italy, serving as domestic workers, concubines, or agricultural laborers. Their presence was a constant reminder that Rome's prosperity was built on conquest. Generations of Romans grew up in households where foreign women, often visibly traumatized, were part of the fabric of daily life. The atrocities of the army thus rippled outward, shaping the very structure of Roman society. And so, when we speak of the Roman army as the most disciplined fighting force of antiquity, we must recognize that its discipline did not preclude atrocity. It enabled it. By enforcing order within the ranks, Rome ensured that cruelty could be carried out systematically, under the banner of law and victory. Soldiers were not rogues acting in defiance of Rome's values. They were the very agents of those values, executing the empire's belief that the conquered existed for the use of the conquerors. This culture of domination was the bedrock of Rome's expansion. It allowed the legions to march into foreign lands with the assurance that anything they did in the name of Rome was justified. It allowed soldiers to view human suffering not as a tragedy, but as a right, a prize of war. And it ensured that beneath the shining image of Roman glory, countless lives were crushed, silenced, and erased. The Roman army's cruelty was not confined to theory or law. It was written into the soil of every land they conquered. Gaul, Carthage, and Judea stand as three haunting examples where the legions did not merely fight wars, but turned entire populations into warnings. In these campaigns, the Roman practice of atrocity crystallized into a spectacle of power, deliberately designed to terrorize survivors and reinforce the empire's supremacy. Take Gaul, for instance. Julius Caesar's conquest of the Gallic tribes in the mid-1st century BCE is often remembered as a masterstroke of military strategy. But behind the carefully polished words of Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War lies a staggering level of human suffering. According to Caesar's own account, his campaigns resulted in the death or enslavement of over 1 million Gauls. That number alone testifies to systemic atrocity. After the siege of Avaricum in 52 BCE, Caesar recorded with cold detachment that 40,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered, with only a handful escaping. To him, it was a military necessity. To the Gauls, it was extermination. The legions moved through their villages like a storm, sparing no one, treating the bodies of the conquered as trophies. Nor were the atrocities limited to the battlefield. Survivors, particularly women and children, were rounded up and sold in mass slave markets, their lives reduced to coin. Gallic women, prized for their exotic features, were dispersed across the empire, from Italy to the Middle East, their bodies a commodity of Rome's military machine. Caesar justified these horrors as deterrence, a way of breaking resistance, but in practice it created a culture where violence against the vulnerable became routine, a soldier's reward for obedience and endurance. Nearly a century earlier in Carthage, Rome had demonstrated the same ruthless logic. The Third Punic War ended in 146 BCE with the annihilation of Rome's greatest rival. Carthage was besieged for 3 years, starved into submission, and then systematically destroyed. Ancient sources describe how once the city's walls were breached, the legions poured in with orders to kill indiscriminately. Men were cut down in the streets, women and children dragged screaming from their homes. The slaughter lasted for 6 days, an orgy of fire and blood that reduced one of the Mediterranean's great cities to rubble. Those who survived were not spared. 50,000 Carthaginians were enslaved and distributed as spoils. For the Roman soldiers, these captives were both reward and humiliation rolled into one, the wealth of a fallen rival made flesh. The destruction of Carthage was celebrated in Rome as a triumph of discipline and power, but beneath the propaganda lay the reality of atrocities so severe that later writers like Appian struggled to describe them without a note of horror. The fall of Carthage was not just the defeat of an enemy, it was the deliberate erasure of a people, made possible by Rome's belief in the absolute right of the victor. And then there was Judea, a region that felt the full weight of Rome's fury during its repeated revolts. The Jewish uprising of 66-73 CE culminated in the infamous siege of Jerusalem. Tacitus, Josephus, and other sources describe scenes that read like nightmares. The Roman army encircled the city, cutting off food and water. Starvation set in, and with it desperation. Mothers were said to have eaten their own children. When the walls finally fell in 70 CE, the legions unleashed a storm of violence. Josephus records that over 1 million people perished in the siege, though modern historians debate the number. What is certain is that the temple, the heart of Jewish identity, was burned, its treasures carried off to Rome. The human cost was devastating. Tens of thousands of survivors were enslaved, paraded through the streets of Rome in Titus's triumph. Women and girls in particular were forced into slavery or sexual servitude, scattered across the empire as living symbols of Rome's dominance. To the legionary, this was not crime but reward, proof that obedience to the standards of Rome yielded both honor and profit. To the victims, it was atrocity sanctified by law and celebrated in marble. What unites Gaul, Carthage, and Judea is the systematic nature of Roman atrocities. These were not chaotic acts of individual cruelty, but policies woven into the fabric of military conquest. Generals authorized them, soldiers expected them, and Roman society applauded them. Cities were destroyed not simply to remove an enemy, but to send messages across continents. Carthage was a warning to future rivals: resist Rome, and you will cease to exist. Gaul was a demonstration of the scale of Rome's appetite. Entire tribes could vanish overnight, their people fed into the slave markets. Judea was a lesson in deterrence: defy Roman authority, and even your holiest temple will be reduced to ashes. The atrocities also served a psychological purpose within the army itself. Soldiers became hardened by repeated exposure to suffering, conditioned to see brutality as routine. When a legionary watched his comrades loot a city, enslave its people, or desecrate its shrines, he was not witnessing lawlessness. He was witnessing Rome's justice in action. This normalization created a feedback loop. The more atrocities were committed, the less remarkable they became. By the time a legion had marched through multiple campaigns, the destruction of cities and the enslavement of women and children were as unremarkable as pitching camp or sharpening a sword. The culture of atrocity thus seeped into the empire's memory. Triumphal monuments like the Arch of Titus depicted enslaved captives carrying the spoils of Jerusalem. Coins minted in Rome bore inscriptions of Judea capta, celebrating conquest by reducing an entire people to an image of a weeping woman beneath the foot of a legionary. These symbols were not accidental. They were propaganda, reinforcing the idea that atrocity was not shameful but glorious. Every Roman who walked past such images was reminded that cruelty was the price of empire, and that the subjugation of foreign peoples was Rome's birthright. And yet, even in the Roman world, whispers of unease surfaced. Some writers, particularly those outside Rome, recoiled at the scale of violence. Polybius, though loyal to Rome, could not conceal his horror at the destruction of Carthage. Josephus, writing about Jerusalem, mourned the devastation of his people. These voices were rare, drowned out by the triumphant narratives of Roman generals, but they remind us that atrocity, though normalized within the empire, was still seen by outsiders for what it truly was: a system of terror designed to sustain Rome's rule. Thus, in Gaul, Carthage, and Judea, we see the Roman army's perverted logic at its clearest. Victory justified everything. Human lives, cultures, and identities were reduced to tools of intimidation and symbols of triumph. Soldiers who committed atrocities were not punished, they were rewarded, their actions enshrined in history books, monuments, and triumphal marches. In this way, atrocity became not the shameful shadow of Rome's greatness, but its very foundation. When a city fell to Rome, the immediate slaughter was only the beginning of suffering. For those not killed outright, a different kind of torment awaited. Survivors, particularly women and children, were forced into a machinery of exploitation that transformed human lives into commodities, their identities erased and replaced with the cold designation of property. The aftermath of conquest was not an end, but the start of a long, grinding existence defined by degradation. The Roman military camp itself often became the first stage of this nightmare. After battles or sieges, captives were herded into makeshift enclosures, tents, stockades, or open fields, where they were sorted according to age, sex, and physical condition. Roman officers and merchants prowled among the captives, assessing their value. Men who were young and strong were marked for hard labor, quarry work, construction, or service in the mines. But women and girls faced a different fate. Their bodies were valued as much as their labor, and the army treated them as spoils of victory, rewards for endurance in battle. This practice was not a matter of rogue soldiers acting outside the law. It was institutionalized. Ancient sources describe Roman commanders distributing women as prizes, both to maintain morale among the legions and to bind soldiers' loyalty to their leaders. These gifts reinforced the message that conquest was not just about victory in combat, but about the pleasures and privileges that victory brought. For the soldiers, it became expectation. For the women, it became a living sentence. From the camp, the next step was often the slave market. Rome maintained one of the most extensive systems of human trafficking in history. After major conquests, entire populations were sold en masse. In Delos, the great slave emporium of the Mediterranean, ancient writers claimed that as many as 10,000 human beings could be bought and sold in a single day. Gauls, Spaniards, Syrians, Jews, Thracians, all poured into the markets, their identities stripped to nothing more than price tags. Captured women were often displayed publicly, their bodies inspected, their health and youth emphasized to increase bidding. The sexualization of captive women was not incidental. Roman society, while deeply patriarchal, was also obsessed with hierarchy and domination. Owning a foreign woman reinforced the status of a Roman man, signaling not just wealth, but also the conquest of another people. Exotic features were prized, blonde hair from Gaul, dark eyes from the East, and these became selling points in the marketplace. Enslaved women thus occupied a paradoxical role, reduced to property, yet fetishized as trophies. Once purchased, the life of a female slave in Rome was defined by servitude and vulnerability. In elite households, she might serve as a domestic worker, tending to chores, caring for children, or attending to her mistress. But these tasks came with no protection. Roman law offered enslaved people virtually no recourse against abuse. A master could exploit, punish, or discard his slaves at will. Female captives, especially young ones, were often forced into concubinage, their bodies treated as extensions of their master's rights. Ancient writers occasionally allude to such practices, though usually in euphemisms that concealed the brutality beneath. For the women themselves, there was no veil of language, only the daily reality of being controlled, inspected, and used. Not all captives entered households. Many were driven into brothels, which flourished across the Roman world. These establishments catered to soldiers, merchants, and travelers, and enslaved women were the backbone of the trade. Brothels were legal and taxed by the state, meaning that the exploitation of captured women was not only tolerated, but actively monetized by Roman authorities. A woman dragged from her homeland might spend years or decades in such places, her body sold repeatedly until age or illness rendered her unprofitable. By then she might be cast aside, left to die in obscurity, her existence erased from memory. Even outside formal prostitution, the vulnerability of enslaved women persisted. In farms, mines, and workshops, sexual violence was commonplace, a consequence of absolute power in the hands of Roman masters. Ancient sources rarely describe these realities openly, but the silence itself is revealing. For the elite authors who shaped our historical record, such practices were unremarkable, so routine as to be beneath comment. Only in occasional moments, complaints about household scandals or satire mocking the lusts of masters, do glimpses emerge of the daily exploitation endured by enslaved women. Children born of these relationships carried the burden of slavery as well. Roman law decreed that the status of a child followed that of the mother, ensuring that even if the father was freeborn or even a Roman citizen, the child of an enslaved woman remained a slave. This legal framework perpetuated the cycle, transforming the bodies of captured women into instruments of demographic expansion for Rome's slave economy. A woman could be forced into reproduction not as a mother, but as a generator of future property. In military settings, the cruelty was magnified. During campaigns, enslaved women often accompanied the legions, either as personal attendants or as part of the army's baggage train. These women lived on the fringes of constant violence, exposed to both the dangers of war and the predations of the soldiers. They cooked, cleaned, and carried supplies, but their presence also reinforced the soldiers' sense of entitlement. For the legionary, victory was not complete until it extended into every aspect of life, including control over the most intimate spaces of others. The psychological toll of this system cannot be overstated. For the captives, there was the trauma of displacement, the destruction of families, the loss of cultural identity, and the daily humiliation of servitude. For the soldiers, there was the erosion of empathy, the normalization of cruelty. Over time, atrocity became habit, woven into the expectations of conquest. When a legion prepared for campaign, Soldiers did not merely anticipate the clash of arms, they anticipated the spoils, the captives, the degradation of the conquered. This dynamic reveals the perverted heart of the Roman military ethos. Atrocity was not a byproduct of war, it was a feature. By institutionalizing cruelty, Rome ensured that every conquest fed not only its coffers, but also its culture of domination. The system dehumanized the conquered while corrupting the conquerors, binding both to a cycle of violence that sustained the empire. Rome's historians and poets, when they wrote of these conquests, often celebrated them as glorious triumphs. Livy praised the discipline of Roman soldiers. Virgil framed empire as destiny. Caesar justified massacre as necessity. The victims' voices are almost entirely absent. Yet in the silences, in the statistics of the enslaved, in the ruins of cities, and the fleeting mentions of women sold in markets, the truth persists. It was not simply nations Rome conquered, but bodies and lives reduced to tools of power. The legacy of these atrocities endures in the memory of Rome as both greatness and horror. Monuments still stand that celebrate triumphs built on mass suffering. Modern audiences, drawn to the majesty of Rome's architecture and military genius, often forget the human cost. But to the millions who were captured, enslaved, and exploited, Rome was not civilization. It was a machine of subjugation, grinding their lives into dust for the sake of empire. If Rome's wars were engines of conquest, its public rituals were engines of memory. The empire did not merely wage campaigns, it staged them. Every triumphal procession, every punishment enacted in the forum, every spectacle in the arena was a reminder that Roman power extended not only over territory, but over human flesh. Atrocity was not hidden in shadows. It was paraded, glorified, and consumed as entertainment. The triumph, Rome's grandest ceremony, was at the center of this theater. When a general returned from victory, the Senate could grant him the right to a triumphal march, a ritual procession through the streets of Rome. Chariots rolled along the Via Sacra, golden spoils glittered and musicians played. Yet among the trophies were not only gold and statues, but people, captives forced to march in chains, their humiliation displayed before cheering crowds. Women, children, and defeated kings walked as living proof of Rome's dominance. They were exhibited like objects, their suffering transformed into the climax of a national festival. For the captives, the triumph was agony. After weeks or months in captivity, they were paraded through hostile streets, insulted, spat upon, and sometimes beaten. The climax often came at the end of the procession, when high-ranking captives were executed, strangled in prison, or ritually killed. Their deaths were timed to coincide with the triumph's conclusion, reinforcing the message: Rome destroyed not just armies but entire peoples. For the citizens, this was reassurance. For the captives, it was annihilation. Theatrical cruelty extended beyond triumphs. Rome's arenas and amphitheaters institutionalized violence as mass entertainment. Gladiatorial combat is the most famous, but the spectacles were broader and darker. Prisoners of war and condemned slaves were forced to fight beasts, reenact historical battles, or suffer public execution in elaborate productions. Writers describe victims dressed as mythological figures, Orpheus, Icarus, Hercules, only to be mauled, burned, or torn apart in front of thousands. The line between history, theater, and atrocity blurred until the suffering of real people became indistinguishable from stagecraft. For enslaved women, this theater often took a cruelly specific form. Though less frequently placed in the arena itself, they were paraded in triumphs exposed in slave markets, or forced into degrading roles in festivals. Their exploitation was not hidden, but displayed, reinforcing the hierarchy of conqueror and conquered. Even in satire and comedy, Roman playwrights mocked enslaved women, turning their vulnerability into a source of humor. Laughter, applause, and cheers, these became the soundtrack to lives destroyed. Why did Rome indulge in such spectacles? Partly, it was political. Public cruelty reinforced the legitimacy of the state. By displaying captives and executing them publicly, Rome reminded its citizens of the costs of defiance. The message was simple: resist, and this is your fate. This political theater created a culture of fear, not only among Rome's enemies but within its provinces, ensuring obedience through the memory of collective suffering. Partly, too, it was psychological. Roman citizens living in a militarized society learned to equate violence with order. Spectacles normalized cruelty, turning it into shared experience. Children grew up watching captives marched in chains. Adults gathered to cheer at executions. Violence became ritual, a binding force of Roman identity. To celebrate Rome was to celebrate domination, and domination was proven in the broken bodies of others. Even religion played its part. Sacrifice was at the heart of Roman ritual, and public executions often blurred into sacrificial rites. To kill captives at the conclusion of a triumph was not only political but sacred, a blood offering to the gods of victory. In this sense, the suffering of conquered peoples was woven into the very fabric of Roman religion. Their deaths were offerings, their bodies the currency of divine favor. The psychological impact on the victims is difficult to measure, but glimpses appear in ancient texts. Jewish sources describe the trauma of parades after the fall of Jerusalem, where sacred treasures were carried alongside weeping captives. Early Christian writers condemned the cruelty of the games, noting the degradation of women forced into servitude or prostitution after being paraded in triumphs. Archaeology confirms the sheer scale of this system. Inscriptions from amphitheaters, remains of execution arenas, and depictions on reliefs showing chained captives beside victorious generals. The material record reveals not only the victories but the cost of those victories etched into stone. This obsession with spectacle reveals a paradox at the heart of Rome. The empire prided itself on civitas, law, order, and civilization, yet the very same system relied on public displays of barbarity. Rome called others savages, but it built theaters where cruelty was ritualized, applauded, and immortalized. This contradiction was not lost on later commentators. Some philosophers, like Seneca, criticized the brutality of the games, admitting that exposure to constant bloodshed numbed compassion. Yet these voices were rare and often drowned out by the roar of the crowd. For the enslaved, every spectacle reinforced their status. To live in Rome was to live under constant reminders of vulnerability. A slave in the household could be punished at the whim of a master. A captive in chains knew that his body might one day serve as entertainment for thousands. Women in particular lived with the knowledge that their humiliation could be made public, their lives turned into emblems of defeat. Even when not in the arena, the fear of display haunted them. This public culture of cruelty also served Rome's long-term memory. Triumphs were commemorated with monuments, inscriptions, and coins. The Arch of Titus in Rome, for example, still displays the menorah looted from Jerusalem, carved in stone alongside captive Jews. For Romans, this was a symbol of glory. For the descendants of the conquered, it was an enduring reminder of loss. Public cruelty did not end with the moment, it was immortalized, written into the city itself. The system worked because it was comprehensive. Violence began on the battlefield, continued in the camps, extended into the slave markets, and culminated in the arena. At every stage, Rome reinforced the same message. Resistance was futile, domination inevitable. This was not merely about power, but about theater. Power displayed, dramatized, and made unforgettable. The cruelty was as much psychological as physical, embedding Rome's supremacy in the minds of both conquerors and conquered. In the end, Rome's theater of cruelty reveals the empire's deepest truth. Its greatness was inseparable from its brutality. The arches, roads, and aqueducts that still inspire awe today were built atop foundations of suffering, celebrated in festivals of humiliation. To understand Rome is to see both the marble monuments and the chains that accompanied them. If Rome's wars were engines of conquest, its public rituals were engines of memory. The empire did not merely wage campaigns, it staged them. Every triumphal procession, every punishment enacted in the forum, every spectacle in the arena was a reminder that Roman power extended not only over territory, but over human flesh. Atrocity was not hidden in shadows. It was paraded, glorified, and consumed as entertainment. The triumph, Rome's grandest ceremony, was at the center of this theater. When a general returned from victory, the Senate could grant him the right to a triumphal march, a ritual procession through the streets of Rome. Chariots rolled along the Via Sacra, golden spoils glittered and musicians played. Yet among the trophies were not only gold and statues, but people, captives forced to march in chains, their humiliation displayed before cheering crowds. Women, children, and defeated kings walked as living proof of Rome's dominance. They were exhibited like objects, their suffering transformed into the climax of a national festival. For the captives, the triumph was agony. After weeks or months in captivity, they were paraded through hostile streets, insulted, spat upon, and sometimes beaten. The climax often came at the end of the procession, when high-ranking captives were executed, strangled in prison, or ritually killed. Their deaths were timed to coincide with the triumph's conclusion, reinforcing the message. Rome destroyed not just armies, but entire peoples. For the citizens, this was reassurance. For the captives, it was annihilation. Theatrical cruelty extended beyond triumphs. Rome's arenas and amphitheaters institutionalized violence as mass entertainment. Gladiatorial combat is the most famous, but the spectacles were broader and darker. Prisoners of war and condemned slaves were forced to fight beasts, reenact historical battles, or suffer public execution in elaborate productions. Writers describe victims dressed as mythological figures, Orpheus, Icarus, Hercules, only to be mauled, burned, or torn apart in front of thousands. The line between history, theater, and atrocity blurred until the suffering of real people became indistinguishable from stagecraft. For enslaved women, this theater often took a cruelly specific form. Though less frequently placed in the arena itself, they were paraded in triumphs, exposed in slave markets, or forced into degrading roles in festivals. Their exploitation was not hidden but displayed, reinforcing the hierarchy of conqueror and conquered. Even in satire and comedy, Roman playwrights mocked enslaved women, turning their vulnerability into a source of humor. Laughter, applause, and cheers, these became the soundtrack to lives destroyed. Why did Rome indulge in such spectacles? Partly it was political. Public cruelty reinforced the legitimacy of the state. By displaying captives and executing them publicly, Rome reminded its citizens of the costs of defiance. The message was simple: resist, and this is your fate. This political theater created a culture of fear, not only among Rome's enemies, but within its provinces, ensuring obedience through the memory of collective suffering. Partly, too, it was psychological. Roman citizens living in a militarized society learned to equate violence with order. Spectacles normalized cruelty, turning it into shared experience. Children grew up watching captives marched in chains. Adults gathered to cheer at executions. Violence became ritual, a binding force of Roman identity. To celebrate Rome was to celebrate domination, and domination was proven in the broken bodies of others. Even religion played its part. Sacrifice was at the heart of Roman ritual, and public executions often blurred into sacrificial rites. To kill captives at the conclusion of a triumph was not only political, but sacred, a blood offering to the gods of victory. In this sense, the suffering of conquered peoples was woven into the very fabric of Roman religion. Their deaths were offerings, their bodies the currency of divine favor. The psychological impact on the victims is difficult to measure, but glimpses appear in ancient texts. Jewish sources describe the trauma of parades after the fall of Jerusalem, where sacred treasures were carried alongside weeping captives. Early Christian writers condemned the cruelty of the games, noting the degradation of women forced into servitude or prostitution after being paraded in triumphs. Archaeology confirms the sheer scale of this system. Inscriptions from amphitheaters, remains of execution arenas, and depictions on reliefs showing chained captives beside victorious generals. The material record reveals not only the victories but the cost of those victories etched into stone. This obsession with spectacle reveals a paradox at the heart of Rome. The empire prided itself on civitas, law, order, and civilization, yet the very same system relied on public displays of barbarity. Rome called others savages, but it built theaters where cruelty was ritualized, applauded, and immortalized. This contradiction was not lost on later commentators. Some philosophers, like Seneca, criticized the brutality of the games, admitting that exposure to constant bloodshed numbed compassion. Yet these voices were rare and often drowned out by the roar of the crowd. For the enslaved, every spectacle reinforced their status. To live in Rome was to live under constant reminders of vulnerability. A slave in the household could be punished at the whim of a master. A captive in chains knew that his body might one day serve as entertainment for thousands. Women in particular lived with the knowledge that their humiliation could be made public, their lives turned into emblems of defeat. Even when not in the arena, the fear of display haunted them. This public culture of cruelty also served Rome's long-term memory. Triumphs were commemorated with monuments, inscriptions, and coins. The Arch of Titus in Rome, for example, still displays the menorah looted from Jerusalem, carved in stone alongside captive Jews. For Romans, this was a symbol of glory. For the descendants of the conquered, it was an enduring reminder of loss. Public cruelty did not end with the moment, it was immortalized, written into the city itself. The system worked because it was comprehensive. Violence began on the battlefield, continued in the camps, extended into the slave markets, and culminated in the arena. At every stage, Rome reinforced the same message. Resistance was futile, domination inevitable. This was not merely about power, but about theater. Power displayed, dramatized, and made unforgettable. The cruelty was as much psychological as physical, embedding Rome's supremacy in the minds of both conquerors and conquered. In the end, Rome's theater of cruelty reveals the empire's deepest truth. Its greatness was inseparable from its brutality. The arches, roads, and aqueducts that still inspire awe today were built atop foundations of suffering, celebrated in festivals of humiliation. To understand Rome is to see both the marble monuments and the chains that accompanied them. For Rome, the battlefield was only half the war. The other half was waged inside the minds of its enemies, where terror could achieve more than legions ever could. To understand the full scope of Roman atrocity, we must view it not through the marble eyes of Roman monuments, but through the trembling gaze of those who faced them, the Gauls, the Carthaginians, the Britons, the Jews, the Dacians, countless peoples for whom Rome became not just a conqueror, but a nightmare. The Roman state cultivated fear with surgical precision. Conquered peoples were made into examples, their suffering amplified by rumor and spectacle until it transcended the local and became myth. The annihilation of Carthage was not simply a victory over a rival, it was a message to every kingdom across the Mediterranean. Carthage, a city that had rivaled Rome for centuries, was reduced to rubble, its people enslaved or killed. For generations after, the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, echoed as proof that Rome's will could obliterate entire civilizations. For tribes further afield, stories of Roman cruelty traveled faster than soldiers. The Gauls remembered Caesar's massacres as warnings etched in memory. Entire villages were said to vanish overnight, their inhabitants slaughtered or taken as slaves. When tribes debated resistance, these tales weighed heavily on their councils. To fight Rome was not only to risk defeat, but to invite extermination. Terror in this sense was preventative. It subdued rebellions before they began. Consider the fate of the Britons. When Boudica led her revolt against Roman rule in 60 CE, she initially triumphed, sacking Roman settlements with devastating ferocity. But when Rome retaliated, the reprisal was so savage that it became legendary. Ancient sources claim that as many as 80,000 Britons were slaughtered in a single campaign. Whether or not the numbers are exact, the psychological impact was undeniable. The lesson was seared into memory. Rome could absorb rebellions, but rebellion could not absorb Rome's vengeance. The Jewish War offers another harrowing example. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE was more than the suppression of revolt. It was the creation of a warning to the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The siege was brutal, marked by starvation, infighting, and eventual slaughter. The temple, centerpiece of Jewish identity, was razed. Survivors were paraded in Rome, their humiliation immortalized on the Arch of Titus. For Jews, this trauma became central to cultural memory, fueling centuries of mourning. For others in the region, it was clear evidence that Rome's wrath spared nothing sacred. The The Romans themselves understood this dynamic. Fear was part of their military doctrine, codified in the concept of terra romana. Roman generals often announced punishments ahead of time, spreading dread before a campaign even began. The very sight of the legionary eagle, the silver standard gleaming above ranks of disciplined soldiers, was enough to unsettle many opponents. But what gave the eagle its psychological edge were the stories that accompanied it. Villages burned, captives crucified, rebels fed to beasts. Rome fought with narrative as much as with sword. Women in particular bore a disproportionate share of this psychological warfare. Female captives, whether queens paraded in triumph or anonymous villagers sold into slavery, symbolized total domination. Their humiliation was not just personal, but communal, a message to their entire people that resistance had failed. When Cleopatra's children were dragged through Rome's streets, it was not only an attack on her legacy, but a warning to Egypt itself. Even royalty could be stripped of dignity. In enemy eyes, Rome's cruelty toward women was an especially potent terror because it struck at the fabric of family, lineage, and cultural honor. This weaponization of fear often allowed Rome to win without prolonged battle. Tacitus records that tribes sometimes surrendered outright, overwhelmed not by Roman numbers, but by Roman reputation. Stories of crucifixions, enslavements, and citywide massacres preceded the legions, sapping enemy morale before the first clash of steel. In this sense, atrocity became Rome's invisible legion, a force that conquered minds before the legions marched. Yet this reputation came with unintended consequences. Fear could unify as well as divide. For some peoples, the dread of Roman domination became fuel for desperate resistance. Boudicca's Britons, Arminius's Germans, and Mithridates' armies in Pontus all rallied against Rome precisely because they knew submission would bring humiliation. Fear thus became a double-edged sword, paralyzing some foes, galvanizing others. Rome often won in the end, but the psychological battlefield was never entirely one-sided. The legacy of Rome's terror endured long after its conquests. For Christian writers, the empire's cruelty became evidence of its corruption, proof that Rome was the beast of prophecy. For later generations of conquered peoples, memories of Roman atrocity shaped cultural identity. Jewish traditions of mourning the temple, British folk memory of Boudica, Gallic legends of Caesar's massacres, all preserved the terror, ensuring that Rome's empire lived on not just in stone ruins, but in cultural scars. In many ways, Rome's enemies saw the empire more clearly than Rome saw itself. To Romans, atrocities were victories, propaganda, and symbols of glory. To their subjects, they were wounds that never healed, reminders of an empire that ruled by breaking bodies and spirits. This divergence of memory between Rome's pride and its victims' trauma ensures that the legacy of Roman atrocity remains contested to this day. Thus, as we step back, we see that Rome's might was not maintained by legions alone, but by stories whispered in fear across villages, tribes, and kingdoms. Rome built not only an empire of stone and steel, but an empire of dread, one so pervasive that even centuries later, the very word Rome could conjure terror. The Roman Empire left monuments that still command the imagination, arches that celebrate victory, law codes that shaped later societies, roads that stitched continents together. But those achievements were inseparable from a darker inheritance. For every aqueduct and forum there was a line of captives, for every inscription of law a marketplace where human lives were auctioned. The same discipline that forged the legions also disciplined cruelty into an instrument of statecraft. In the end, Rome's greatest strength, its ability to impose order, became a mechanism that normalized and amplified the most perverted atrocities of its army. Across the provinces, the consequences were visible in both immediate destruction and slow cultural corrosion. Cities razed and populations uprooted left gaps not only in demography, but in memory. The children taken into slavery, the women sold and abused, the entire communities that vanished. These were not incidental losses. They were structural. They altered family lines, extinguished local traditions, and transformed social relationships in ways historians still trace today. An empire that claimed to civilize the world left behind a trail of social ruptures, griefs, and silences that generations would carry like buried wounds. Inside Rome itself, the routine of atrocity changed the conquerors as much as the conquered. Men who returned from campaigns with laurels in one hand and captives in the other brought home not only wealth but a hardened view of humanity. The triumphal parades, meant to sanctify military success, also normalized spectacle as a means of social instruction. When entire streets chanted as chained prisoners passed by, when coins and columns broadcast the humiliation of provinces, the city's moral imagination adjusted to accommodate cruelty as civic ritual. What had once been a rare horror became a civic rhythm. That normalization had corrosive effects on Rome's own institutions. Law and ritual were used to justify excesses. The ius belli made atrocity lawful, triumphs made it legible and laudable, and public entertainments made it familiar. The Republic's republication of virtue and the Empire's rhetoric of clemencia, mercy, sat uneasily beside policies of wholesale slaughter and humiliation. When political leaders used spectacle and punishment to shore up legitimacy, the distinction between governance and intimidation blurred. Politics itself could be sustained through theatrical cruelty, and successors learned that terror could be an efficient substitute for consent. The human cost, however, cannot be captured in policy alone. Think of the mothers who watched sons carried off into slavery, the children who grew up knowing their status as chattel, the women who were forced to barter what dignity remained for survival. The law that declared captured people spolia did not account for their interior lives. It did not reckon with the way trauma transmitted down generations, the whispered warnings to daughters, the altered marriage practices in borderlands, the ways communities rearranged themselves around the fear of being looted or displayed. History's statistics, numbers of enslaved, cities razed, triumphs recorded, are dry markers of deeper human catastrophes. Over time, the strategy of terror produced diminishing returns. At first, the spectacle of cruelty produced the desired effect: submission, tribute, political stability. But terror is brittle. It can suppress revolt, but it also breeds deep resentment, a seedbed for eventual upheaval. Rebellions, sometimes brutal and desperate, rose up precisely because people could tolerate the indignity no longer. Internal collapse, fissures in governance, and economic inefficiencies followed. The more Rome relied on coercion and spectacle, the more it had to invest in policing, manpower, and constant displays of dominance to maintain its facade. Empire required maintenance. Cruelty made maintenance endless and costly. Moreover, the moral contradictions Rome generated opened it to critique from within and outside. Philosophers, moralists, and later religious movements saw in Rome's practices not glory, but moral failure. Voices from the margins of Roman culture, philosophers like Seneca, early Christian commentators, and even some provincial writers, condemned the spectacle of suffering. They argued that a polity founded on justice could not indefinitely rely on ritualized cruelty. Those critiques did not stop the atrocities. They did, however, preserve an alternative memory and a language of dissent that would outlast the empire at its zenith. And the empire's shadow did not end with its political demise. Rome's practices left templates that later powers would adapt. Successive conquerors borrowed the theatricality of domination, the use of public spectacle to communicate political lessons, and the commodification of captured peoples. In that sense, the Roman model of using atrocity as policy became an inheritance, a historical precedent that normalized certain ways of waging war and administering domination across centuries. Yet even within this bleak ledger of violence, there were threads of resilience. Across provinces, people preserved languages, secret rites, folk songs, burial practices, and kinship networks that could not be fully erased. Some captives survived to become ancestors of new communities. Some enslaved women maintained traditions in whispered lullabies passed to their children. What Rome could buy with coin and control with chains, it could not entirely buy. The capacity of human communities to remember, adapt, and resist in subtle ways. Memory, even when bent by trauma, became a repository of refusal. That paradox, of ruthless suppression on one hand and stubborn human survival on the other, is central to the story we have traced. Empires can impose structures of domination, but they cannot wholly extinguish the human habits of care, remembrance, and cultural continuity. The victims of Rome's worst practices did not simply disappear, they were absorbed into new social orders, and their traces persist in dialect, ritual, and law long after marble monuments were toppled. So what is the lesson we take from this? It is not a cheap moralizing that reduces Rome to an evil caricature. It is rather a complex truth. Greatness and atrocity can coexist within the same historical formation. Rome gave law and roads, literature and engineering. It also extended its power through policies that brutalized entire populations and normalized humiliation as political theater. Recognizing this duality is not to diminish achievements, but to balance the ledger of history, to see both the infrastructure of civilization and the human costs that made it possible. We confront this legacy not merely as historians cataloging events, but as citizens of a world where the echoes of imperial violence still matter. When modern states deploy spectacle to intimidate, when they normalize human commodification or public humiliation, they echo tactics perfected in antiquity. The past is not a museum behind glass, it is a set of templates and warnings. Remembering Rome's full story, its roads and its raids, its law codes and its slave markets, its monuments and its markets' cries, equips us to recognize and resist similar patterns today. Finally, to those who have followed this documentary to its end, these are not stories meant for morbid fascination. They are reminders. The people whose lives we have described were real, their suffering profound. Our responsibility as storytellers and viewers is to honor those lives by refusing to let them be absorbed into uncritical nostalgia or into a simplified tale of glory. We must hold both the achievements and the atrocities in view. If this examination moved you, if it compelled you to reconsider what you thought you knew about Rome, take one small action now. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and tell someone the part of the story that most surprised you. Each share is a small act of historical justice, ensuring that the victims' stories are not forgotten and that future audiences learn the full cost of empire. History's monuments remain useful only when we remember who built them and at what price. Because remembering is not merely an intellectual act, it is a moral one, and the memory of those who suffered under Rome deserves no less than our full attention.